Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. As the country reeled this week from the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history, and as investigators scramble to uncover the motives and methods of gunman Stephen Paddock, President Trump traveled to Las Vegas Wednesday to meet with the shooting victims and first responders in Sunday's attack at a country music festival. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
The mass murder that took place on Sunday night fills America's heart with grief. America is truly a nation in mourning. We struggle for the words to explain to our children how such evil can exist, how there can be such cruelty and such suffering. But we cannot be defined by the evil that threatens us or the violence that incites such terror. Words cannot describe the bravery that the whole world witnessed on Sunday night. Americans defied death and hatred with love and with courage. We will all have to wrestle with the horror of what has unfolded this week, but we will struggle through it together, and we will overcome together as Americans.
Let's bring in Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger and columnist Mary Anastasia O'Grady and Bill McGurn. So, Bill, what do you make of the president's response?
I think it was right. It was the right tone. You know, a president needs to go and visit. He's a national figure. I also think the tone of the people out there. You know, we saw incredible stories of bravery, and it's a very American story. People in official positions standing up and not running away from the fire. There was a Marine that stole a car to drive people to the hospital. The security guard who, you know, got shot. And the doctors. It's an incredible story of, you know, the government has a big role, but a lot of people took the initiative themselves. And so amid the heartache, there's a lot of inspiration there about how ordinary people behaved.
Yeah, and I think in the aftermath also, the law enforcement in Las Vegas has been really impressive. Sheriff Lombardo has been holding these press conferences and speaking very clearly, being very careful with what he knows, what he doesn't know. And the press is just hounding him, asking the same questions over and over again, but he's really held his composure. A really, like Bill says, a very heroic story.
But, you know, the president's role at these days when events like this get so widely publicized, horrible event, the country is bereft. They just feel completely shocked down to their shoes. And the president goes out there, I think, as the representative for all of us. He's saying what we feel and what we would convey to those people if we were there. And I think Donald Trump did it in an extraordinarily appropriate way, representing the American people.
Not polarizing at all.
Not at all.
He's basically trying to speak to our own better angels.
Yeah.
Okay, so, Mary, what about the way the debate has turned elsewhere? It pretty quickly devolved into another debate over gun control.
Yeah, well, you know, it's another crisis that some people don't want to let go to waste. And certainly there's a lot of cynical, I think, politicians, entertainers. But I think one of the big problems is that, as Dan says, I mean, the American public is just so shocked and stunned at this that their first reaction is, do something. Can we do something? Because this, we can't abide this. And so therefore it opens the door for these, you know, discussions about gun control, even though people basically know that there is no easy answer to this problem.
But what does it say? I think, yeah, I think most of us, certainly my reaction to this was, oh my God, is anybody I know in this crowd?
Right.
These are people who went to a concert, okay,
right,
in a place where, you know, most Americans in their lifetime will visit,
right,
Las Vegas,
right,
and you don't expect to be shot at,
right,
and have people falling all around you.
Right. No, I was looking at the New York Post's pictures of all the dead. The largest chunk seem to be 30-year-old women, just out for a night out. They don't enjoy it. I think Mary, characteristically, is a little nicer than I am on this. I don't think that the reaction that you were speaking up is really more. There's a reaction not just for gun control, but to characterize those who disagree as haters and evil. I mean, when you have Jimmy Kimmel it means you've lost the argument.
When you're depending on him, you mean to make the case.
To make the case. These people do not want a rational argument. Look at Twitter. Look at the stuff about the internet. It's all about blood on their hands and this. We could have a sensible argument of what are practical measures that may not eliminate this, but might make it less possible. They don't want that. This is a wedge. I think, frankly, it's despite what they want, it's playing into Donald Trump's hands.
Is anything, Dan, that you have seen proposed here on in the wake of this, whether it be eliminating bump stocks to make a semi-automatic weapon fire more rapidly than it's supposed to, or more background checks or other things, would anything have prevented Paddock from doing this?
Nothing that we know of right now. I mean, I think the focus is misplaced. It isn't so much be on the weaponry itself in the United States, but on the sorts of individuals who commit these crimes, whether they're deranged or, say, a terrorist.
But Paddock didn't fit either of those profiles.
I understand that. But, for instance, Stephen Paddock, as an example, bought his rifles in 4 different states. Now, if we had, using something like big data software that would have tracked the fact that he was buying these rifles in 4 different states, just as, say, a terrorist is buying fertilizer and elements in 4 different stores into a central database, then you could focus on someone like that. I know there are privacy concerns, but I think we have to consider something like that.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Thank you all. When we come back, calls grow for new gun control measures in the wake of the Los Angeles massacre. But will more laws stop the next mass shooting?
I am also calling on President Trump to bring together the leaders of Congress and let both sides know he is ready and willing to address this issue of gun safety.
This country has the loosest set of gun laws allowing dangerous people to own dangerous weapons in the industrialized world. And so what is unacceptable in the wake of the most deadly mass shooting in the history of the country is for this utter silence, this unintentional complicity from Congress to continue.
Renewed calls on Capitol Hill for gun control legislation in the wake of the Las Vegas massacre. But would more laws have prevented Sunday's killings, and can they stop future mass casualty events? Earlier, I spoke to law professor David Kopel. He's the research director at the Independence Institute and author of the book, The Truth About Gun Control. David Kopel, welcome. Good to have you with us. New calls for gun control in the wake of Las Vegas. I want to take these arguments, if we can, based on what we know, one by one. So let's start with automatic weapons. If Stephen Paddock had automatic weapons, that was illegal under the law, correct?
Yes, a 1986 federal law said that no new automatics can be sold to anyone in the public, and ever since 1934, even owning an old one has been a process that requires about 9 months to get federal permission to do so.
Okay, so let's go to semi-automatic weapons, which means you can file with a single pull of the trigger, one shot. Now, he had a lot of those, apparently, including some AR-15s, which are a popular form of semi-automatic weapon. If he adapted those to be able to make more rapid firing like an automatic weapon, that's also illegal under federal law, right?
It depends on how the adaptation is done, and the particular thing that it appears he used, something called a bump stock, is currently legal under the federal statutory definition. I think that's something that Congress should have hearings on.
Okay, let's talk about that, because that's gotten a lot of attention. Why would a normal person who has a rifle want to use a bump stock?
It's mainly for guys who want to go to the range and shoot a bunch of rounds off quickly. That's been the market for it. It's not something that degrades the accuracy of the gun, so it makes it less useful for self-defense, and obviously it would be unlawful probably to use it in hunting.
Is there another way to adapt without a bump stock? Is there another way to adapt a semi-automatic in a way that could allow it to become automatic?
There are conversion kits which genuinely change a semi-automatic into a fully automatic, but those are already regulated the same as a real automatic. So post-1986, it's impossible to buy a new one.
Okay, but if you're a determined killer, you're somebody like Paddock, you can find a way, can you not, to take a semi-automatic weapon and turn it into a rapid-fire automatic?
Well, you could go to someone who's sophisticated with machine shop skills, and if they can work down to tolerances of a thousandth of an inch, it's possible to do that modification with tools.
Okay, so I think what a lot of people who are just average citizens who say, you know what, I want to go to a concert which is safe. I don't want to have to worry about my son or daughter getting shot at a public event, a country music concert or something else. They say, you know, do we really need rifles like the AR-15 to be legal? Why not ban them all? So you can't run the risk of anybody being able to adapt them into a truly killing machine.
You can understand why people think that, because this seems so incomprehensible. And as you say, people have a right to be safe when they're out in public places. But if you're going to go down that road, which Australia went down, then you're talking about gun confiscation from tens of millions of people, and that's unlikely to work out. The drug war hasn't been too successful in this country, and this would be something much, much worse than that. Besides getting rid of the Second Amendment, we'd probably have to get rid of the Fourth and Fifth Amendment too.
So your argument is that it's illegal, would be illegal under the Second Amendment to ban these kinds of guns in the first place, but also even if you did succeed in changing the Second Amendment or passing a law that the court said was legal, you'd have a major problem just politically on your hands getting hold of those guns.
Yeah, this is a country that was founded in part in 1775 when a gun confiscation program was implemented at Lexington and Concord, and people didn't like it then. This is something that would really cause a lot of danger for law enforcement if they were ever forced to go out and try to confiscate guns from the public.
Well, Australia did it. As you know, they outlawed many guns in the 1990s, and they had a big buyback program where the government went out and purchased guns. I think they purchased something like more than 650,000 guns. A lot of people point to Australia and say, you know what, that actually worked. They haven't had the same kind of mass casualty events that we've had here in the United States. What's your response to that?
Well, the fact you say is true, although New Zealand also hasn't had those kinds of mass casualty events. And New Zealand didn't change its gun laws. And countries like Norway or France that have much more repressive gun laws than the United States still have mass casualty events, including sometimes with many more mass casualties than even in Las Vegas.
So you could,
in general, Australia and the United States have both seen a long-term decline in their murder rates. Australia at a time when it was confiscating guns, and the United States over the last quarter century at a time when we added 80 million guns to the national gun supply.
Okay. So I guess what would you tell the average American who says, I do want to go to events, I want my family to be safe? What can we do to stop mass casualty events with gun regulation, or is that simply impossible?
I think it depends on from event to event, and I think in this case the issue of bump stocks, which it's alleged at least, and it seems to be true, make a semi-automatic firearm fire as fast as an automatic, probably should be regulated at the same level as a machine gun. So you should have to go through that same federal process to purchase one.
Okay, all right. Thank you, David Kopel. Appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
When we come back, an unusual and public denial from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson this week as he seeks to dispel reports of bad blood with President Trump.
I'm not from this place, but the places I come from, we don't deal with that kind of petty nonsense. My commitment to the success of our president and our country is as strong as it was the day I accepted his offer to serve as Secretary of State. There's never been a consideration in my mind to leave. I serve at the appointment of the president, and I'm here for as long as the president feels I can be useful to achieving his objectives.
That was Secretary of State Rex Tillerson this week in an unusually public denial of a report saying he had been on the verge of resigning from his cabinet post over the summer. Tillerson also condemned as petty nonsense rumors that he called the president a moron in a Pentagon meeting. Wednesday's statement came just days after President Trump seemed to undercut Tillerson in a tweet, saying that America's top diplomat, quote, is wasting his time trying to negotiate with Little Rocket Man, referring to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Mr. Trump and Tillerson are also said to be at odds over the Iran nuclear deal, with the president expected to announce next week whether he'll decertify the pact. Let's bring in Dan Henniger, Mary Anastasia O'Grady, and Bill McGurn. So this kind of thing, Dan, what does this tell us about the Trump foreign policy team? Dysfunctional?
Well, I don't know whether it's dysfunctional. I would say as a baseline, we understand that Donald Trump is a very unusual president in his conduct of foreign policy or anything else. That's not news. But, you know, all presidents wax and wane in their enthusiasm for the Secretary of State and the State Department. Nixon didn't care for it so much until he put Henry Kissinger over there. John Kerry rose because he was willing to execute Barack Obama's policy on Iran, with Susan Rice calling the shots in the background. Donald Trump clearly does not favor the State Department. He's running foreign policy out of the National Security Council and the Department of Defense. So Rex Tillerson sits there as something of an outsider. His problem is that because Trump has got this nonstop battle going on with the press, any distance perceived between Tillerson and Trump is going to be elevated and used as a wedge between him and Donald Trump's foreign policy.
Okay, but you have put this in the context of Trump and his cabinet. Okay, he has publicly attacked Jeff Sessions, Mary. He's publicly fired Tom Price after humiliating him in public. Now he's really, I think, 2 or 3 times at least 2, I think, contradicted Tillerson publicly. Most recently in that tweet on North Korea we talked about. Tough to work for a guy who does that.
Yeah, I would say that they could kind of patch that up if they could fix what you would call strategic communication, sort of get on the same page. But there's another problem that Tillerson has, which is that he came into the State Department with this idea that he was going to overhaul the place. So he's got these consultants who are going through and looking at what the problems are and so forth. Deputy Secretary John Sullivan last week went before the House Foreign Affairs Committee and said, we're almost done, which is going to be a good thing. But in the meantime, the secretary has left 22 vacancies in assistant or deputy positions.
Those are key policy decisions.
Exactly, and the problem is that in their place are career Foreign Service officers who tend to be bringing with them all the baggage of the former administration. So I think that's part of where this clash is coming with the president.
And there are some policy disputes. We mentioned the Iran deal. We mentioned the North Korean exchange. But there's also Qatar versus the Saudis. Right. Trump was with the Saudis. Tillerson wanted to be a mediator. There's also the climate deal where he disagreed with the president. So there's a major policy disputes.
Right. Well, you have to get on board with your president. If you're outlining differences there, that's a problem from you. Look, I'd say one thing. Trump is obviously a very difficult man to work with, but if you called your president a moron at a meeting at the Pentagon, you're a moron. There are very few places where you can call your boss a moron and survive.
The Wall Street Journal being one.
Now, I actually feel a little more optimistic about State, having read this Politico argument saying that he's destroying the State Department, and this was written by a staffer to Samantha Power, so I started thinking, oh, maybe he's doing something good. Also, finally, on substance, on the North Korea thing, I think Trump was actually right in that tweet. Now, if it's a good cop, bad cop thing,
you mean the negotiation is just not on?
Look, if it's a good cop, bad cop thing, I'm not so sure that's bad. Tillerson, goes through negotiations, and Trump is saying, well, we're not really sure. The real problem there is we've been talking to the North Koreans for 25 years. We actually reach agreements with them, and then they defy them. They're not gonna, even if we reached a deal, there's no way they're gonna obey it.
But you made the point that certain secretaries of state have often been isolated and so on. But it really does mean that when Rex Tillerson goes out to Asia, as he did, to be the Sherpa for the president's trip in November, people don't know, does he represent the president or not? And that makes it a very hard thing for him to do his job.
Yeah, and I think that applies to some extent to the other individuals you mentioned, like who have been criticized by the president, Jeff Sessions, Tom Price, who is no longer here. And what you end up with is a situation where these cabinet secretaries are no longer working out of loyalty to the person in the presidency, but for country or a cause, and that matters. And if Rex Tillerson thinks he can still contribute to the causes that he is working for, then he should stay. But if he decides at some point that he can no longer do that, I think it would be time to step away.
I would add one thing, though, but it should be the president's agenda. If he says, I'm going to stay and I'm going to undermine getting out of Paris, I'm not going to be with them on North Korea, I don't think you serve someone and undermine their goals.
But, you know, Rex Tillerson is a seasoned executive. He has to be very, very frustrated to say that the president is a moron in the meeting. It shows the level of frustration, I think, for a lot of people in the cabinet.
I should just add that his spokeswoman said that he didn't say that.
Right.
So just for the record, we don't know, of course, what really happened. Still ahead, as the Supreme Court kicks off what is shaping to be a blockbuster term, we'll take a look at the cases and justices to watch. The Supreme Court returned to work this week, and from religious liberty to union dues to partisan gerrymandering, it is shaping up to be what Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has called a momentous term. Here with a look at the cases and the justices to watch is Ilya Shapiro. He's a senior fellow in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute and editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. So welcome. Good to have you here. Do you agree with Justice Ginsburg that this could be a blockbuster?
I think so, and especially compared to last term with Scalia's absence, with the 8-justice court, they just weren't taking high-profile cases. And this term already, I think we have 5 or 6 that are legitimate blockbusters.
Okay, so give us a couple here. I know the partisan gerrymandering case, which is an oral argument this week, that could remake American politics by getting the judiciary right in the middle of every electoral map in the states.
Absolutely. You'd have even more lawsuits about every district drawing after, it already is a cottage industry for lawyers in Washington and elsewhere. This would be an election lawyer full employment act, and we'd never see the end of it. We'd have judges drawing districts all over the place if they decided to uphold the challenge. Of
course, we had an oral argument. You follow that, I'm sure. How do you read where that's going to come out? It looks to me like Justice Anthony Kennedy, once again, the swing vote.
Yeah, not surprisingly, in this case, like the last couple of times that the court has taken up this issue, it's all on whether Justice Kennedy feels that now is finally the time to constitutionalize some sort of standard for evaluating when politicians use too much politics in drawing district lines.
Did you get any reading of where he's going to come out from the oral?
No. I mean, you can guess, but unless you hear it from him directly, I wouldn't believe it.
Okay, then what about the big religious liberty case, which is the one that's coming up with the cake baker who declined, based on conscience, religious conscience, to bake a cake for a gay marriage? That's another big one where Kennedy is also, I think, a swing vote.
Yeah, this is called Masterpiece Cake Shop, and here I think Kennedy is, again, the swing, but it really brings into attention 2 things that he's become known for, what his legacy will be. He's a very strong supporter of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. He's also written all of the court's opinions expanding gay rights over the years. Now, at the Cato Institute, we've been filing briefs in support of gay marriage, and now we're supporting the baker or others in private business who don't want to work the gay marriage, because private businesses are different than the government. So for us, it's easy to square that circle. We'll see how Kennedy does, and there's different ways that you can slice this case, if you will, whether it's expressive kind of business with a wedding vendor that does a message of some kind, if you accept that artisanal baking is that, versus non-expressive businesses like limo drivers or caterers. There's making a contract for a specific type of cake versus willing to sell it off the shelf, but this will be an explosive case.
Okay, and then another one related to free speech is the so-called union fees case, where the court, which was close a couple of years ago to ruling on this, and then Justice Scalia died. Now, with 9 justices, it has come back. And this is a case where it's going to be concerns whether or not the government can compel somebody to pay union dues that goes for speech that they don't support.
Well, the argument is by the states, about half the states allow this for unions to charge non-union members in the public sector with union dues to support collective bargaining. They're called fair share fees. But the challengers here are municipal workers out of Chicago and Illinois. 2 years ago in that case you mentioned, that was out of California. Same issue. They're saying, look, in the public sector, anything unions collectively bargain is a matter of public policy, is a matter of speech, because they're dealing with public finance. They're dealing with education priorities, whether to give tenure protections versus higher salaries, all of these sorts of things. And we might not like what that union is supposedly doing in our favor. I think the court is poised to strike down these laws. I think they were 2 years ago. They're going to do the same thing now. And that would really remove a lot of money from public sector unions as they go about politicking. That would change American politics as well.
Okay, this is the first term that Neil Gorsuch, the first full term that Neil Gorsuch will sit. Based on the few cases he was involved with last year and what you know about him, how is he going to change the dynamics on the court?
Well, you don't really know how things go behind the scenes. Justice Byron White, for whom Gorsuch clerked, said that every new justice makes for a new court. I don't know if you'll see very many differences in terms of voting patterns. I think Gorsuch is somewhere in that Scalia to Thomas range, both on the substance and on various jurisprudential doctrines. I'm seeing some very green shoots, I suppose, from his rulings when he was on the lower court in terms of not being as deferential even as Scalia to government in administrative law, regulatory matters. In the cases that he sat in so far, there's just a month and a half at the end of last term, he voted together with Thomas on every single one, and he's been active in terms of questioning and in terms of writing concurrences and dissents. So he's certainly adding a strong voice. We thought maybe losing Scalia, there'd be more time for the advocates to talk, but we haven't seen that. And from where I sit, I'm very much looking forward to the constitutional seriousness that Gorsuch is bringing.
It sounds to me like what we're going to see is it's going to go back to the kind of court dynamics, at least in votes and ideology, that we saw before Justice Scalia died, briefly.
Very much so, and including on criminal procedure cases where it was the left and the right against the middle. We've seen that even this week in a couple of arguments where Gorsuch is joining the liberals in protecting constitutional protections for criminal defendants.
All right. Thank you, Ilya Shapiro. Appreciate it. When we come back, Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, just one of President Trump's judicial successes. We'll take a look at his efforts to remake lower courts when we come back. As Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch begins his first full Supreme Court term, President Trump is rapidly working to remake the lower courts as well. The White House announced its 8th batch of judicial nominees last week, with some notable picks on the appellate and district court levels. We're back with Dan Henninger, Bill McGurn, and Wall Street Journal editorial board member Alicia Finley. So, Alicia, this is a story that is somewhat below the radar with everything else going on in Washington, and most people focusing on the Supreme Court, but Trump is really rapidly remaking the lower courts too.
Right. So he's made 18 nominations to the federal appeals courts and 39 to the district courts. Last week he made another 4 to the Fifth Circuit.
4 on one circuit.
Right. And this is a traditionally more conservative circuit. But the reason why this is incredibly important is Obama really packed the courts when he was in office, especially the D.C. circuit. And what you're seeing is a lot of these judges are striking down some of Trump's rulemakings already, or his decisions to pause rules.
Okay, so what kind of judges is he nominating? Let's take those Fifth Circuit. You got Stuart Duncan was one of them. He was from the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty and argued the Hobby Lobby case that said closely held companies don't have to abide by Obamacare rules on abortion, for example.
Right, and then you have Don Willett, who a lot of people know from his witty Twitter feed, and he was was on the Texas Supreme Court, as well as James Ho, who was a former Solicitor General in Texas.
These are generally really very solid conservative judges. Some of them originalists in their interpretation of the Constitution, in the mold of Gorsuch and Scalia.
Right, and that's partly because he's used the Federalist Society as a clearinghouse, and that has allowed the expedited the selections.
Federalist Society being a kind of it's a group that of conservative judges, lawyers, not just judges, lawyers, and so and Trump has put them in a very prominent position, Dan, on vetting judicial nominees.
Yeah, and I think it's had a very positive effect. If there's one criticism we have heard is that there could be more nominees that are from the law and economics school, which applies economic rationality to the law in the way that, say, the very famous Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit. He just retired. Posner was one of the godfathers of law and economics. But perhaps over time we'll see more of that introduced in the nominees.
And, I mean, I think Bill Trump promised this in the campaign.
Right.
And delivered.
I think actually the dare, remember he promised it in response to, I think, a Ted Cruz attack on what kind of judges he would be. It helped Trump because he's on the record as saying these are the kind of judges I'm going to pick. It also, look, in the Republican Party, judges are one thing people understand. And it's very important.
And it's a unifying force in the party.
It's a unifying force because it's not only about we want people that interpret the law and the Constitution. For Democrats, the appellate courts and the Supreme Courts, that's their legislature. That's where they like to go and ram through things that they can't get through any Democratic legislature in the states or at the federal level. So it's very important, and they will come back to rule on things that Donald Trump does as president. But it's something we understand. You know, when I was in the Bush White House, they understood the process and the kind of nominees. It's one area where the Republicans really do have their act together. And I'd just say one last thing. The Supreme Court has a busy docket, some really important cases, and I think at the end of the year, we're all going to owe Mitch McConnell a huge thank you for getting Neil Gorsuch on there instead of Merrick Garland.
Well, and that's something that's interesting, Alicia, because I think I think that McConnell is doing his best to get all of these nominees through. Now, the Democrats are throwing up every possible roadblock, taking every delay they can. But in the end, and I've talked to Republican senators, they're saying every one of these people is going to get through.
Right, it's just going to take a little longer.
Right.
Unfortunately, you do want to get them on, especially there is the concern that Democrats could take the Senate in 2018, so you want to get these on the courts as quick as possible, especially because there are new cases pending.
All right, oral argument this week. Dan, gerrymander case, you ain't got any tea leaf reading here for Justice Kennedy, which way he goes? Because it's a big case.
It is a big case, and, you know, we should understand that gerrymander is very difficult. Gerrymander started in this country in 1788 when Patrick Henry tried to gerrymander James Madison.
And Bill voted in that election.
There are gerrymanders in Turkey and in Sudan, and if you have representative government, they come from districts, and the people in power are going to try to draw those districts in a way that favors them. And the question is there any fair way to do that? And I would guess that Justice Kennedy, I mean, the one solution du jour these days is to turn it over to nonpartisan commissions in the states, as they have done in some states, Florida, California.
But he can't do that as a matter of policy.
He cannot do that as a matter of policy, but he could suggest that they go in that direction rather than, as these plaintiffs are saying, judges should decide. And Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, was very clear about not wanting the judiciary to get involved in these really intense political fights over gerrymander.
Where do you think it goes, Alicia?
Well, I think, you know, Justice Breyer kind of teed this up to Kennedy, kind of setting out a test that he could potentially use, and one of those, the standards in the test was whether it was done by one party, and which is kind of steering Kennedy could potentially say that a commission would not be subject to judicial review.
All right, still ahead as President Trump visits hurricane ravaged Puerto Rico. Just what will it take for the island to recover, and are promises of debt relief realistic?